And here we are, Coalition Purple. Hey, it's been a long drought here. Sorry for the last couple weeks. Been a couple crazy weeks, but fortunately, nothing has happened basically in the last couple weeks. So we haven't really missed anything.
Yeah, we're very blessed to be in a very slow-moving period of time where nothing radically changes overnight, and there's no news stories to speak of. So it all works out.
Yeah, we probably wouldn't have had anything to talk about anyways the last 2 weeks. So anyway, so I don't know if anything's happened in the last few hours or not, but maybe you got something to start with.
Well, I mean, I hate to say it, but in the last few hours, something has happened.
Has it? I've been running to meetings and stuff, so I'm kind of disconnected at the moment.
Well, I just heard about it because I was driving around and I happened to have the car radio on. So, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to get into this too much. I mean, I don't even know if it's appropriate to mention it, but I guess there was a school shooting in Florida. So, that literally just happened. So, I mean, again, since we put it out there, has anything happened in the last few minutes? Well, as it turns out, actually it did.
Yeah, actually something has.
I don't know any details of it, so I'm not going to talk about it that much. But I mean, our hearts and best wishes go out to anyone who was hurt or injured in this particular case.
Well, and I think there was one 2 days ago or so, another one at a high school, I think it was. But that's the weird part about the whole mass shooting thing. I mean, it used to be big news.
Yeah.
And it hardly, gets on the radar anymore. There's so many of them. But like we've talked about before, even as bad as they are still a relatively small percentage of the people who are killed by firearms.
Yep.
But they do get all the attention.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's happened sort of in that vein, and we're sort of getting off on a weird start here. But did you hear about somebody set the Pennsylvania governor's mansion on fire?
Yeah.
That's what I heard that and I was like, no, that can't be true. And then I saw the pictures of it. It practically burned down.
Yeah.
Burned out big parts of the mansion. I'm like, and that apparently there were people in the mansion at the time.
Yep.
The only thing that keeps going through my mind is, how is this guy getting into the governor's mansion with a bunch of gasoline and sitting around setting it on fire, and nobody's like, hey, don't set the mansion on fire. It's like, it's one thing if somebody just rushes in and then pulls the trigger on a gun and instantly shoots somebody, but I mean the guy had to be in there spreading gasoline around for at least a little while before he actually set it on fire, and what, nobody noticed? To me, it's bizarre.
Yeah, and he climbed over. I mean, the fence would look like it was pretty high fence that he had to get over, and it's just like, wow, I guess if people are determined.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those things where it's just like, it's not even. I mean, nobody was hurt or injured in it, so it's not some kind of huge tragedy.
Thank goodness, yeah.
But it's just bizarre. I mean, so you just walk onto the grounds of the governor's mansion of Florida, and you set it on fire, and that kind of thing.
Pennsylvania, yeah. Yeah, I know. Well, kind of bouncing off that. I mean, that is one of my biggest concerns about just the state of where things are, and it just inspires people to be crazy. Now, this guy that did the Pennsylvania governor mansion thing, I mean, obviously, I think it sounds like he's had some pretty severe mental health issues. But it's just fueling that kind of tension and across the country, and all again, we keep coming back to the third party thing. All the more reason you need a third party to get everything. Let's cool down the temperature a little bit here and talk about how to work together to solve issues versus continuing this fighting between each other. And I literally just came from another meeting with somebody that I never bring these things up. And they're just like, well, what do you think about all this stuff going on? And his whole thing was, Democrats and Republicans they're just like dividing us on purpose, and it's like, yeah. And that's why I'm not part of either one of those anymore, And I think there's so many more people that are waking up to that realization that this is being done on purpose in many, many ways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's always been sort of my reasoning behind my thinking as far as like why we need a third party. It's really easy to divide two groups. I mean, you have Group A and Group B. They're divided, and whatever Group A does, Group B says is bad. Whatever Group B does, Group A says is bad. But if you put in a third group, and it's not just A versus B, it's A versus B and C, and B versus C and A, and C versus
Right.
B. It's not so easy to just say, one group is completely wrong all the time about everything, because there's another group saying, hey, well, I mean, that's not really accurate. They
Right.
can say in one instance, Group A could be right, or Group B could be right, or the other A and B could say that C could be right. And it's not so easy to just say this group is evil, bad all the time, horrible. Don't ever listen to them, blah blah blah. And so if we had more diversity in the political parties and more thought and more, just general information out there, it would just be, it would be better.
Well, yeah, and I think I would hope, anyways, that it would sort of naturally lead to more kind of fact-checking kinds of things, because you have that additional voice, at least one more additional voice, hopefully not, hopefully even more than that. But I think that's so much of it that people are in their little silos that you just need, another source to kind of fill that void that's out there where people are just not fact checking. When I was talking to this person today, it was, one of those things where he was kind of, and I won't even go into the topic, it doesn't matter, was kind of reiterating things that said, well, have you checked that? If that's really true, on some of those facts, because it's like, I don't know if that's really true. But that's, that's where we're at,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you can't believe a whole lot that you hear.
Yeah, and as I say, it's a lot of time there are things where it's like a partial story. One group
Right.
will report part of it, and the other group will report part of it. Whatever it is that they feel like sort of supports whatever message that they want to get out, and then so you never really get the whole story. But if you had a third credible source, you could say like, wait a minute. Both things can be true, both things can be wrong. Maybe one
Right.
person is right, maybe the other is wrong. But there's, all kinds of different, nuance to things that, gets ignored so much. But if you had another group that was interested in that nuance, they could come out and say, hey, it's like we need to look at all the parts of this and,
Yes.
try and figure out something, to do this better.
Yeah, well, and the other part I think that would be a good byproduct of it too is, and again, not to skewer people, but to point out when people are being hypocritical. One of the things that just continues to drive me nuts is on both sides. Again, both sides talk about how, Group A is being hypocritical about this topic, or Group B is being hypocritical about this topic. And that kind of came to mind when I just had that laugh when I was reading this story the other day, I guess in Utah. Is it Utah? It's either Utah or Idaho. They just passed a law saying that it was actually Idaho because it's Boise that's involved. They passed a law, state law, that says cities and the states and any government building, they can't fly. They can only fly basically the American flag and the state flag. And Boise, but they didn't, in the law, they don't put any consequences that, well, if you're
Yeah.
Boise and you go ahead and fly the rainbow flag, this is what's going to happen, right? So there's no teeth in this law. And so Boise, of course, is just continuing to fly the rainbow flag, which personally for me, I understand the need for that, because you start down one road, which flags are you going to fly and all that.
Right.
And, I mean, that was even has happened here in Vista, where there was last year, I think it was, where there was the talk about the whole rainbow flag thing, and they ended up agreeing, okay, we're going to fly that. But it really takes you down that road where it's like, okay, so if you do it for one
Yeah, don't you have to do it for
cause
everybody?
or topic, you really have to do it for all. So. And where I was going with the hypocrisy thing, why I found funny about that particular one is because you hear, at least, and again, this is probably where my old Democratic bias kind of comes in that, but the conservatives are always saying that, freedom of speech, there's no freedom of speech, we're not getting our fair share of speech, blah, blah, blah. Yet they're turning around saying, but when it comes to rainbow flags, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. And it's like, okay, now I think that you can have a legitimate argument whether that's right or wrong, or how do you treat people fairly. But if you're saying that people deserve freedom of speech and the flag is a piece of freedom of speech, how can you pass a law about that? That should be a policy thing, maybe, for the city to decide whether they want to do that. But starting to pass laws, which is it? Do you want speech, altered, or do you just want to let people go and decide what they feel is right locally?
Well, I'll take the opposite side of that one. So, my feeling about it has always been is that an individual citizen, you or me, if we want to fly any flag that we want on our property for any reason, and we drive around and you see Trump flags or you see Biden flags or you see rainbow flags, if any person wants to do that, that is absolutely their business to do. Problem is, when it comes to government, anytime you're an advocate for one thing, you're pretty much almost always going to be discriminating against somebody else. And that's where the problem comes in. If you say, we support this group with the rainbow flag, well, that means everybody who doesn't support that group, you're essentially discriminating against. And the problem is it's the government. So the government should be completely non-discriminatory. They shouldn't take sides in things. They should have rules and laws that are applied equally to all groups. But as soon as you fly a flag, whatever that flag is, then you're an advocate. So if Mississippi wants to fly a cruciform cross flag over their state building, well, that's a problem. I mean, they might like that because they're a very Christian community, but Mississippi isn't Christian. Mississippi is part of the United States, and it's a non-denominational place that has respect and for the rights of all the people there. And therefore, they shouldn't be flying any flag to advocate anything. And I feel the same way about any flag that's in Idaho or anywhere else. You fly the American flag because we're all Americans. You fly the state flag because everybody in that state is part of that state, and then that's it. You shouldn't. The government shouldn't pick winners and losers. This group is, we like this group and we don't like this other group. And it goes to, there's so many things that you could say that are like that in, like all the affirmative action stuff and all the DEI stuff. All that stuff is advocacy. And you could say, well, this group has been downtrodden or historically damaged or something. And I do have some sympathy for those arguments because I've always said that I actually supported affirmative action for a very long time. But I think it was actually Ruth Bader Ginsburg who said that at some point it has to end. And I personally feel that we're kind of at that point. But it's like, if you're going to be an advocate for one group, if you're going to say, because this was one of the things that came up with Harvard, and Harvard is getting a lot of grief right now from the federal government. We want to have a more diverse student body, so we're going to do things to affirmatively bring in more Black students, more Hispanic students. It's like, okay, well, that's advocacy. That's good. That gets more diverse campus at Harvard. And, so great. On paper, on first level order thinking, that sounds really good. The problem is, to achieve that, what they ended up doing was horribly discriminating against Asian students.
Right.
And so it's like, the idea that you want to advocate for somebody is nice. And as far as private groups and organizations and people, advocate for anything that you want, all that you want. But when it comes to the government, you got to play it straight down the line. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not a big fan of the government flying anybody's flag for any reason.
No, I totally agree. I'm 100% in agreement with that. I just found the irony of it because the same rationale, to your point, like in Mississippi, and I think it's Mississippi or it might have been Alabama, I can't remember, is really pushed hard to get the Ten Commandments posted in, Capitol buildings and in schools and things like that. And it's our right, freedom of speech, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, you got to apply the same rules, in my mind, on any of that stuff, that where you're representing a particular group or philosophy or whatever. So I am not a proponent of flying the rainbow flag across municipal buildings. Not because I'm very supportive of me personally, I'm very supportive of the cause, but it just takes you down this rabbit hole, but it was more the hypocrisy of it that it was like, okay, which is it? As long as you're not messing with my speech, here in Idaho, we're okay with it. And, and you can do that on both sides. You can do it on, the rainbow flag, or like you say, some of the things going on in the South or whatever. And it's like, well, where do you draw the line? Is that a state thing? Is that a federal thing? How do you control that? Because in my mind, it's like, well, if Boise decides they want to fly that flag, then what people who are upset about it, I think it was the wrong decision. They shouldn't fly it. But if they do decide to do that, your recourse is vote those people out. Because it has to be the council that approves that, right? So that's where we as citizens need to take an active role. And to your point, I don't think it has anything to do with being an advocate for any particular cause or group or whatever, in terms of what you do personally. But when it comes to a government taking a stand on that stuff, we shouldn't be doing that for anything.
Yeah, that brings up about 10 things that I could talk about forever. I love the fact that you brought up the idea of having the Ten Commandments posted in various different courthouses and things, because the argument that the religious conservatives make, at least the one that I've heard over the years from people that I know, is that, the Ten Commandments is sort of the wellspring of Western law, right? So it's like everything is stacked upon that. You start with the Ten Commandments, and then you get the Magna Carta, and then you get, this and that, and then eventually you get the U.S. Constitution. So It's all part of the same lineage of Western thought, and therefore it's appropriate to be in courthouses. But I've always thought, and this is just me personally, it seems to me that the founders took great care to be nonpartisan, non-denominational. There's not a whole lot of Jesus said this, Jesus said that. I'm quoting the Bible here and there in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights or the Declaration of Independence. They made references to God, but it's very sort of non-denominational, not necessarily Christian, not necessarily Jewish, not necessarily Hindu, Islamic, or whatever. And so if the founders went out of their way to realize, hey, the founders definitely had very strong religious beliefs and religious values, and a lot of their values were in this sort of Judeo-Christian vein.
Sure.
But if they're going to take the effort to be sort of open-minded about having a country that is a community of many different thoughts and religions, well, I think we should do the same thing.
Absolutely.
Let's treat it in exactly the same way. Let's not have Christian, Jewish, or Islamic iconography anywhere. We don't need that.
Right.
We're a big tent country that is accepting of all religions and all denominations, and therefore we don't need anything that sort of idolatrizes any part of any religion. And therefore I don't think we should have the Ten Commandments posted, because I think if the founders of the country wanted to have the Ten Commandments posted somewhere, they would have posted it somewhere, and they didn't. And so it's that's always been my kind of feeling about it. But I think it's actually kind of a really interesting kind of argument. Actually, it's one thing that I actually kind of like talking about.
Yeah. Well, and what's the interesting part, when people use the position that, hey, we were kind of founded as a Christian nation, which is not, in my mind, really true, they forget. They never tell the other part of the story. Is you do recall that a large chunk of this country was founded for the very specific reason they were trying to get away from the Church of England and all the crazy stuff that was going on in Europe in terms of religion. They were trying to run from that, right?
Yeah. Because
of the oppression, in essence, that was being caused by that at that time. And they never tell that part. It's like, well, there's a reason why the founding fathers did what exactly you described, because they didn't want to get into that position again that we have a state religion or a state king or whatever, right?
Right.
And they never tell that part.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean that, when you think of it, that's what the First Amendment is. It's the
Yeah.
idea that we're founding a country that is free from religious discrimination. You will be allowed to worship as you see fit.
Yep.
Congress shall pass no law, mandating
Right.
the religion. So, if they're going to go out of their way to make that the First Amendment, to say that Congress shall pass no law, regarding religion, I think we ought to respect that down to the last nut and bolt.
Absolutely.
And not put a lot of iconography of anything anywhere.
Yeah.
And so, I've just sort of always felt that way. I was trying, it's funny. There was something else that I was thinking about as far as like the courts go. I'm sure it'll come to me at some point. It's like weird, I'm getting at that point in my life where things come into my brain and then they go out. It's not
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, man, I'm telling you. Well, actually, I'm speaking of the courts. It's been very fascinating again, and this is where I keep coming back around to third parties, and the reason to be so connected to the local situation is because the people that we put into, particularly the Senate, but across the board, is so important because they're creating these lifelong positions for these judges and all that. And I think in general that's held pretty well because you're freeing people from the influences somewhat of politics, although they're not really too free in many respects. But it's interesting to see how that's all playing out through all this. And you would hope that all the things that have been going on since Trump's come in power, and you hope that wakes people up. People don't get too excited about the kind of the judiciary in terms of the role of government in many ways until it starts to impact them on certain things like this. And this is going to be a good lesson, I think, for all of us to see, okay, does this theory work when we make these, lifelong appointments? Are they going to hold true to whatever they decide is fair, right?
Yeah. Well, that actually jogged my memory to what I was thinking about, and it's about judicial jurisdictions and, who really wields the most power and who is subordinate to who. So the thing is, the way that everything is set up, the way the founders had it is the judges get lifelong appointments so that they can be free from, outside influences or however you want to look at that.
Right.
But because they're appointed for a lifetime and sometimes they're appointed politically, they have very restricted jurisdictions, at least in theory. Meanwhile, the president has vast power and authority to do, virtually anything, but gets reelected every 4 years, an incredibly short term, less time than a senator. So the idea is that the check and balance on the executive is elections. You don't like what the executive done over the last 4 years. You didn't like what Biden did over the last 4 years. You kick him out. You put somebody else in. You don't end up liking what Trump does for 4 years. Well, you kick him out. And it's 4 years. Obviously a lot can happen in 4 years, but it's still a relatively short period of time. But the check on the judiciary is theoretically jurisdiction. They are supposed to rule on the cases that are in front of them. And then they're not supposed to sort of generalize things to the rest of the country constantly. It's like, well,
Right.
I'm just saying that the entire country can't do this. Well, who elected you to do that? No one, because you're not elected. And so it's like, as these court decisions come on, I think we're going to have to come to terms with the idea that great power is wielded by those people who are elected, the legislature and the executive, and diminished power is attributed to the people in small jurisdictions for the judiciary, with the one exception, of course, being the Supreme Court, and obviously they're, sort of up there in, Article 2, Article 1, Article 3. But, the people that are elected have to have the ability to do what they were elected to do. Otherwise, we're ruled by some committee of judges, off in Washington, D.C., who, no one voted for, maybe nobody wants, and maybe nobody agrees with. So it's going to be interesting, and it's all going to come back to the idea that the true check on authority, on power in the United States are elections, which is why we have to fix our elections. We have to have a better system of parties, a better system of elections, And we have to be more responsible about the people we are electing. And to do that, to actually be responsible about who we're electing to office, we need to have sufficient choices to pick somebody who's actually good, rather than always trying to vote for the lesser of two evils.
Absolutely. No, it all comes down to that, and it all comes down to our responsibility as citizens to really think about that and uphold the Constitution in our own right, right? And
Right.
it's just going to be interesting. I think the only real difference I would have with what you said is that at the end of the day, although the Supreme Court changed this a lot during all the flurry of lawsuits a while back with Trump, there really isn't any way to check a president in many ways who is blatantly not. I mean, the Supreme Court, and I go back to the El Salvador thing with the people they shipped off to El Salvador, where they blatantly say, we're just going to ignore the Supreme Court. And it's like, well, if even the Supreme Court agrees that they are ignoring the law, you do have to have, and I agree, 4 years is a relatively short period of time. A lot of stuff can happen in 4 years if you really want to do it. And
Yeah.
I think that's what Trump is testing, to see how far and fast, he can take advantage of that situation without the courts getting in his way.
Well, first of all, laws are only as good as the people who enforce them.
Right.
Period. So if we get to a point where the people we've elected or appointed are just going to ignore the law, then we're pretty much screwed.
Yeah.
But I would say, just sort of from a fundamental standpoint, and I go back to the founding of this country again, the more I think about the founding over the years, I mean, the people who came up with our system of government are absolutely brilliant. But
Yeah.
I would much rather put the power to do, basically whatever, in somebody who gets elected every 4 years, than in the hands of people who are in power permanently and are not answerable to anyone ever. Now, it's true that we may elect people that are really bad and end up doing really bad things. That's on us. That's on the population of this country for electing bad people that do bad things. And but if we say, okay, we're so afraid that that the electorate is not capable of electing a decent human being to do a job, that we're just going to transfer all the power to make all the decisions on everything to this unelected judiciary branch. Well, I mean, we might as well just shoot ourselves in the head, because we've wiped out the country if we do that. Because now that the country is being ruled by people who are entirely unanswerable to anyone, and that's awful. And the other thing that's sort of interesting, and I know sometimes my brain seems to be going a mile a minute these days, but like the courts are entirely incapable of even doing the things that they're suggesting, that the president has to do. Like, my favorite thing was when the judge ordered the president to turn around the plane. And I heard a really good comment. I think it was just a comment that I just read on the internet, and it was like, how does the judge know how much fuel is on that plane? And I was just like,
Right.
Yeah, actually, that's entirely practical. The judge telling the plane to turn around, he doesn't know what the air traffic control situation is. He doesn't know if it can make it to another landing strip. It doesn't know how much fuel is on board. It doesn't know the conditions of the pilots. When was the last time they slept or had it? He's entirely incapable of knowing anything that even remotely relates to what he's ordering. So we don't want that person ordering these kind of things, because he's completely in the dark about everything. So that's why we have an elected branch that has many layers of people that are responsible for knowing what's going on, how to execute certain things. And then you just have to sort of hope that, they are not too horrible over the 4-year period, and then you can kick them out of office. But having an unelected judge trying to make decisions about things that they have no concept of, I mean, that's a terrible idea.
Yeah, well, only in defense a little bit of the judge, however, I think his main issue was they didn't, after the fact, didn't present any evidence of that kind, right? So if they had come back and said, hey, listen, there was no way we could turn around this plane because of the gas or whatever, then that would have been a legitimate argument. But they basically have refused to present any information about anything for the most part, other than the number of people that were dropped off, and that they are all bad people, except for the ones that aren't bad people. And and so that I think that was the crux of where he got to the point where he is now with the contempt potential contempt part of it is they are not providing any information whatsoever to, there could be some very legitimate reasons for what they did, right? And but going back to the whole premise of the Constitution, and that's just getting the due process. It's like I was thinking, like, when 9/11 happened, there were a lot of terrorists that were still here in the States who were supporting that effort, and we rounded all those people up. They all got trials. They were kind of somewhat sham trials, but at least they got you. We knew who they were. We were told who they were. We told what they supposedly their role was before they all got shipped off to Guantanamo. That's right. But at least you knew that much information. We don't know anything really about the people that were shipped off to El Salvador.
Well, the one guy that is sort of in the news about the
one guy we have
trying to play back, that they want to bring back, as far as due process goes, I think it's a really interesting question because, what does constitute due process? So apparently that particular guy, as I say, there's not enough information to really to
right.
know exactly what all these other people were. So he appeared before an immigration judge and was ordered deported, and then he tried to appeal that, and then he was ordered deported. And so he did have due process, but in the course of that due process, he was found to be a member of MS-13. He said he was afraid of being killed by other gangs, quote-unquote rival gangs, because he was part of a gang. So he basically admitted himself that he was part of MS-13. So it's like we do know something about him, and we do know that he did have a final order of deportation. And then, how the Trump administration handled that whole thing, I'm not too delighted about. But it's like, the bigger question is what constitutes due process? I mean, for you and me, if we're American citizens, theoretically we have
right.
due process rights that exceed somebody who's in the country illegally. And so one of the things I hope the Supreme Court does decide is what exactly are the due process rights for someone who's in the country illegally? I know that there are some laws that say, like, if you're apprehended within like 20 miles of the U.S. border and you've entered illegally, whoever apprehends you can just send you right back into Mexico.
Right.
Without anything. They can just say, like, well, you cross the border here, I see you, you're going back. Done. Finished. So is that like the entire level of due process that anyone gets? Or is there more? And one of the things that I've been finding really interesting is the whole habeas corpus, the writ of habeas corpus. It's like, well, even though I'm not a U.S. citizen, I still have the habeas corpus right. So I can still say that I've been inappropriately detained and I can make, I can make an appeal based on that. But then there's all kinds of rules about habeas corpus that you have to follow, apparently, things which I didn't know because I'm not a lawyer. But there seems to be this wildly variant degrees of what due process actually is. And so it would be really nice at some point for the Supreme Court to sort of lay it out. If you're in the country, regardless of who you are, where you came from, or why you're here, you have these set rights that you can make appeals on. And then beyond those rights, you don't. And then if you're here and you've done something, you've broken some kind of law, and you're in the country illegally, then the executive has the power to remove you from the country. But it would be nice to have sort of like a clearer idea of like what it is that can and can't be done.
Yeah, and I think that from as I understand it, it really hinges basically on one word, right? The Constitution doesn't say a citizen has the right to due process. It says any person.
Right.
So it's going to come down to that how they want to interpret or define that is when we say person, I mean, in my mind, that's a person. It doesn't. It's not saying you're a citizen or not a citizen, and so it'll be interesting to see how that all, because it's going to go back to the Supreme Court now, very quickly.
I think the recent ruling from the Supreme Court was unanimously agreed that a person does have due process rights.
Yeah,
they didn't really establish exactly what that meant, and that's the problem.
Right.
Is your due process only that?
Yeah,
you get one hearing before an immigration judge, and then you're on your way, or are you entitled to some kind of appeal, or I mean, what is it exactly? And is there a difference between someone who's a citizen versus a green card holder versus a student visa versus somebody in the country illegally? Right. It's like clarity. Let's kind of lay out what it is that the process is for removal, and then try and abide by the rules. Because right now it's like kind of like the Wild West. The Trump says, again, we're sort of like starting to go over time, but the whole thing about facilitate, have you followed any of that? Where the Supreme Court
Facilitate. What a lame word.
Yeah, the Trump administration is supposed to facilitate the return of this guy Abrego Garcia, and so the Trump is like, well, we'll facilitate his return by arresting him when he shows up at a port of entry, and it's like, was that facilitation? I mean,
I know.
I don't know what do you mean by facilitation? It's like it's open to, because the judge is like, well, you should go into El Salvador and get this guy back and bring him here today. That's his idea of facilitate. And the idea of the Trump's administration idea of facilitate is that, well, we'll just arrest him when he shows up at a port of entry. It's like, well, those are obviously wildly different ideas about what the word facilitate means. And so we should at least have some clarity on that.
Exactly. I mean, that was such a lame way for them to get out of that whole thing.
It was terrible.
It was like,
once again,
seriously,
thank you, Judge Roberts. Because you know how much I love that guy.
Yeah, right. It's just like, seriously. I mean, you couldn't have come up with a better word than facilitate.
I mean, come on.
Talk about a word up for interpretation. It's like, oh my
seriously.
gosh. Yeah. So, anyways, what's weird? Riverside, this is completely off topic now. Riverside, they changed the interface yet again. That's our recording software here. Do you see anywhere on the screen where it says how long we've been recording?
For me, it's upper right-hand corner. It says you and one other, and right next to it, it says 36 minutes and 17 seconds.
On my side, there is no place. I'm glad you know. And apparently we've gone over as usual.
Yeah.
Literally, I swear, every time I log in here, they've changed it. And it's like now on my side, nothing. So.
Yeah, it's funny. It just says that I'm a guest, and it has a little picture of me. And then right next to that, it's got a little timer. It says 36, 40.
Yeah, well, that's what it used to have on my side, too. But it doesn't exist on the administrator's side, which is what I am. So,
well,
anyways.
how are you supposed to administrate if you don't have access to the administration information that you need?
Well, I'm going to call them and ask them to facilitate putting that back on my screen.
It'll be very interesting to see the responses you get.
Well, we better leave it there for now, and we'll catch up with you next week.
Yeah, it was good to talk again. I'm glad you had a good trip, and see you next week.